So today, we're beginning our work to become more skilled in the art of civil discourse. And as you know, these tumultuous political times have prompted the League of Women Voters of Oregon to adopt a formal position on civil discourse. And this is it. Promote civil discourse through action and education for all government bodies, staff, and citizens for the purpose of improved public policy decisions and processes. Civil discourse means, at a minimum, mutually respectful, courteous, constructive, and orderly communication. You can see that there may be times the League would like to comment on public behaviors. Our speaker today is an expert on this topic. David Brewer recently retired as an Associate Justice of the Oregon Supreme Court. He was elected to the Supreme Court in 2012. He began his career in private practice here in Lane County and then became a circuit court judge, also in Lane County. He moved to the Court of Appeals in 1999 and was chief judge of the Court of Appeals from 2004 until he moved to the Supreme Court. He's long been an advocate of mediation and alternative dispute resolution. And if you think about our definition of civil discourse, respectful, courteous, and constructive, you will find no better example of it than in the person of Dave Brewer. So please welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you today. And it's a special treat for me to be here with the League of Women Voters, because as I was telling the folks at the table I was eating at a couple of minutes ago, I've run for statewide office 5 times. And each one of those times I was interviewed by the League. The League was the only organization that I think was interested in providing factual, objective information on a lot of the down-ballot races, including the nonpartisan races where folks really have a hard time knowing who the candidates are and who to vote for, whether they should vote for a candidate. So it's a real privilege to be here with you today, and especially to talk about this important subject. I told Linda and Nancy that I've got some prepared remarks. In fact, you're asking me to be here today to talk about this really forced me to think hard about it for the last couple of months, and so I hope we have some time to interact back and forth a little bit afterwards. I know you need to leave at 1:15, but I think we can use the time today, I hope. Well, you know, George Washington sometimes gets credit for writing the book on civil discourse. It was called George Washington's Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. That's a long title. And actually, it was a list that had been created by 16th century Jesuit priests that Washington copied as a penmanship exercise. But the list stuck, and for the most part, Washington, I believe, history shows, tried to live by the rules published in the book. Today, many of them sound a little fussy and outdated, but they do reflect a broad focus on other people rather than a narrow focus on self-interest that seems increasingly difficult to find in our public discourse today. The first rule, every action done in company ought to be done with some sign of respect for those present. If followed faithfully, would go a long way toward improving the discourse in our country. And following the last rule, labor to keep alive that little spark of celestial fire called conscience would help us do the right thing more often. In between, there's wisdom about keeping promises, not believing rumors without facts, not bragging about yourself, and not taking pleasure in the misery of others. Fussy or not, Washington's rules represent more than just manners. They describe the small sacrifices that we all need to be willing to make for our mutual good and in order to live together in a community. Much later in his farewell presidential address, Washington recognized, though, that differences of opinion were a necessity to a free society, and he also warned us about them. And in beautiful words, he described debate as a fire not to be quenched, but it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. In his book on Washington, Richard Brookhiser wrote that all modern manners in the Western world were originally aristocratic. Courtesy meant behavior appropriate to a king's court. Chivalry comes from chevalier, meaning a knight in the Old French. Yet Washington was to dedicate himself to freeing America from a king's control. Without realizing it, the Jesuits who wrote them and the young man who copied them, and who himself was a slave owner, were outlining a system of civil discourse that ultimately would produce a model of government for treating all people as equals. And 60 years later, as the nation stood on the brink of civil war, Abraham Lincoln implored Americans to think of the better angels of our nature before committing totally to the dissolution of the Union. To plea for civil discourse during the most bitter and divisive period of American history was an attempt to call on a cultural tenet of respect for those with whom you disagree. And on the eve of the Civil War, just before Sumter, Lincoln continued reaching for common ground, saying, "We are not enemies, but friends. Though passions may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." And even though his effort to prevent war was not successful at his second inauguration after 4 years of bloody carnage, Lincoln pleaded for the nation to heal and restore civility. He told a divided America, "With malice toward none, charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in, to bind up the nation's wounds." The value of civil discourse was a necessary component of our culture at the founding because the framers devised a union of different states that, then as now, was led by people with different ideas about how a federal state should look, but were all committed to the ideas of freedom of belief and expression. Our most able leaders understood the core truth that a government created by people holding strongly divergent views couldn't survive, let alone flourish, without basic elements of civility and respect for fellow citizens. So as a tool of pragmatic ethics, Americans and their leaders understood early on that our success as a nation depended on our ability to disagree within a framework for civil discourse. Today, things feel different for a lot of people, don't they? We seem to be witnessing an erosion of civility in our contemporary political discourse, where bombast is often met with approval, extreme viewpoints are greeted appreciatively by a disturbingly large segment of the American electorate, and so the incentive for political leaders to make such comments is at an all-time high. And of course, in a free and democratic society, there always have been, always will be people who hold views that are extreme or unpopular, and it's their right to do so. But in this country, politicians haven't always been able to earn points with their constituents by being egomaniacal, indecent, uncivil, and just plain rude. Bill Clinton once said, "When people feel uncertain, they'd rather have someone who is strong and wrong than someone who is weak and right." To many folks, it looks like that's what is happening in America right now. In 2007, I think we all remember watching a televised town hall meeting in which GOP presidential candidate John McCain argued with a voter who made erroneous claims about Barack Obama's citizenship and religious beliefs. I remember McCain being booed by some of the people in the audience for simply saying, "President Obama is a citizen and a family man, but I disagree with him about many things, and that's why I want to be president." McCain's response was a model of civility. But the reaction to his comments and similar behavior of other politicians today are enough to make any reasonable person wonder if common manners, decency, and civility are values that we take seriously in politics or in society itself. The president, of course, looms large in discussions about the lack of civility in public dialogue, but he is not alone in this trend. Far too many public figures on all sides of the spectrum are too willing to cast aspersions, make threats, or otherwise fan the flames of hatred and mistrust. In this kind of environment, there's a tendency to ignore the substantive challenges that we all face in favor of negativity and bitterness. The political rewards for uncivil behavior may give candidates a bump in the polls or increase their fundraising profiles, but the cumulative damage that such behavior can inflict on the fabric of our society cannot be swept aside. All of the world's great religions and secular philosophies have elevated the golden rule that we should do unto others as we would wish done unto us. And there's an underlying public hunger for those values that we see all around us. 2 days ago, the National Geographic published its list of the happiest cities in America. Every one was a place where people said they had strong and supportive interpersonal relationships. And as an explicit response to the overt meanness in public discourse, we're actually seeing the golden rule itself exalted in TV commercials, including a hotel chain ad that's currently running on prime time. People who respond positively to these messages aren't just naive idealists. They understand that politics isn't beanbag and that debates on important issues can and should have an edge. But they think that what we have today often goes beyond an edge. And they see that the elements of our society charged with keeping things civil don't seem to be taking strong enough action on that front. We need solutions to difficult problems, but our culture often seems to reward meanness and incivility. People feel legitimate frustration and anxiety about what economic, social, and other forces of modernity are doing to them and how they will affect the future of their children. But a pluralistic society can't deal with these problems and thrive when basic norms of decency don't prevail. For these reasons, I believe that most people grasp that Lincoln's words have real meaning and that our political leaders need to have the moral credibility to appeal to the better angels of our nature and their own. So how do we make that appeal? Especially when cautionary voices point out, as did Washington, that conflict is the life of democracy, and that an obsession with the niceties of language and demeanor can stifle healthy political debate. As the national conversation on civility gains momentum, we need to carefully consider what civil discourse, rightly understood, means and why it matters. So let's just take a couple of minutes and start at the beginning. In Latin, civilitas was the conduct expected of citizens in good standing, who were willing to give of themselves for the good of the city. In its modern context, the civil person is someone who cares for their community and who believes that the claims of others to well-being and happiness are as valid as their own. Just what Linda read at the beginning. Many, indeed most Americans, still discern that connections between civility and ethics, civility and health, civility and quality of life are real. In fact, new momentum is emerging around the notion that a vigorous practice of civil discourse is necessary for the healthy survival of society. What gives true civility importance is, first of all, its connection with ethics. If you look at the principle of respect for persons, a cornerstone of all ethical systems known to history, it states that we're to treat others as ends in themselves, rather than as means for the furthering of our personal advantage. In other words, our behavior has to be informed by empathy, the ability to identify with the other person. To put it more simply, civility does the everyday busy work of goodness. Imagine a supervisor at work harshly criticizing a worker in the presence of colleagues. And then the worker retaliates by making the supervisor look bad in front of the big boss at the first opportunity. This kind of behavior is disruptive, stress-inducing, and affects the health of employees and businesses. Studies have shown that protracted exposure to stress caused by living in an uncivil environment increases the chances of contracting heart disease. And the American Psychological Association has estimated that workplace stress, including the effects of absenteeism, loss of productivity, medical expenses, and turnover, cost U.S. business about $300 billion a year. In contrast, when we engage in a civil exchange with a friend or coworker, our bodies release neurochemicals that lower our stress levels, make us feel better, and strengthen our immune systems. The bottom line, if we practice these skills, we behave in ways that make people want to keep us around them. Through the bonds we forge, we avoid isolation, which is a predictor of early onset illness and death, and the harmonious relationships that civility fosters have a positive impact on our overall well-being. But civility has another practical benefit. In the words of the 18th century poet Mary Montague, civility costs nothing and buys everything. Now, these words have some self-conscious hyperbole, but they provide a valuable reminder as we move forward in 2017. With all we face together, the best elements of civil discourse are more necessary than ever because they allow us to deal with conflict through mutual respect without permanently damaging relationships. History is rife with examples of thinkers who understood the practical role that civil discourse plays in a well-ordered society. The framers assumed that their fellow citizens' pursuit of personal interest would be bound by self-regulation. John Adams saw with particular clarity that without allegiance to those principles, no government could survive. He wrote in 1798, "We have no government capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality. Avarice, ambition, revenge would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." In Britain, and I love this person's thinking, there was a judge named John Moulton. Most people have never heard of him. Most judges have never heard of him. But he observed that between the things that we do with unrestricted freedom and those we do because they are prescribed by law, there exists a middle ground that he called obedience to the unenforceable. In that middle ground, our actions are influenced by a sense of what's the proper, responsible, and decent thing to do. Coaching a Little League team, participating in a neighborhood watch program, being the president of the League of Women Voters. Civility and good manners belong to the realm of the unenforceable, but the more a society relies on self-regulation, the more civil it is, the less need it has to legislate, and the less it will be plagued by coercion, conflict, and litigation. What Adams and Montague recognized is that for any society to survive and thrive, the total amount of goodness circulating at any given time has to remain above a certain level. We're the world's trustees, not just of the air we breathe, the water we drink, but of one another's quality of life, contentment, and happiness. As one observer has said, civility is the shape that care takes. It's a beautiful statement, too. There's no simple history of this modern civility movement. It's been debated within the legal world since the early 1970s, when judges and lawyers became concerned with unruly courtrooms and popular impressions that their profession was stocked with crass, win-at-all-cost opportunists. To address that problem, the American Bar Association passed a resolution affirming the principle of civility as a foundation of the rule of law and urged lawyers to set a high standard for civil discourse as an example to others in resolving differences and without disparagement. It encouraged political parties, government leaders, and the media to take more meaningful steps toward promoting a more civil and deliberative public dialogue. And beginning in the 1980s, many colleges adopted codes of civility to protect a diversity of viewpoints and ensure that campus conversations honored academic freedom. On a more ambient level, the 1987 elimination of broadcasting's fairness doctrine, which required broadcasters to honor multiple political perspectives, forever altered our expectations about hearing both sides of a story, at least from a single source. From that point forward in the world of media, fair and balanced could mean almost anything. In the mid-90s, a fellow by the name of Pierre Forney, I don't know if many of you have heard of him, he was a professor of Italian literature at Johns Hopkins. He started an unlikely second career. He wanted people to be nicer to each other. As the story goes, an epiphany struck him one day while he was in class that the most valuable lesson he could ever teach his students was to treat each other with respect. So he turned his attention to a range of everyday interactions, from the treatment of strangers to the importance of etiquette, and he bundled those various concerns under the rubric of civility. But the arc of his career, from scholar to kindness consultant, indicates the extent to which the idea has currency today. Over the past decade, though, civility has gone beyond this sense that we ought to do the right thing, not because the law forces us to, but because it's necessary and appropriate. And it's come to assume a more prescriptive dimension in some contexts. At a time when our ideological divides feel extreme, some people think of the call to civility as a polite call for them to fall back in line. Nowhere has this concern been expressed more vocally than on college campuses. A telling example is the case of Stephen Salaita,
who was a scholar of colonialism. His job offer at the University of Illinois was rescinded a few years ago because of a series of uncivil tweets that he posted in response to a firefight between Israelis and a Palestinian. Few dispute the fact that his tweets looked like shock and grandstanding tactics. In one tweet, he wondered if anyone would be surprised if Benjamin Netanyahu appeared on TV with a necklace made from the teeth of Palestinian children. But debates have raged over whether his perceived incivility was a legitimate ground for losing his job, and ultimately the legal system said no. As a result of this controversy, the university was censured by the American Association of University Professors, and Salida received in excess of $800,000 in a settlement. And when Nicholas Dirks, who was the chancellor at UC Berkeley, later that year, 2014, sent an email to faculty and students asking them to honor the 50th anniversary of the free speech movement at Berkeley with a focus on civility, he said, "As we honor this turning point in our history, it's important to recognize the broader social context required for free speech to survive. We can only exercise our right to free speech if we feel safe and respected in doing so, and this requires that people treat each other with civility. Courteousness and respect in words and deeds are preconditions to any meaningful exchange of ideas." He said, in this sense, speech and civility are two sides of a single coin, the coin of open democratic society. Well, bloggers and online commentators immediately criticized his message, with some on Twitter calling it Orwellian and wrong-headed. A legal blog even offered a line-by-line critique of the chancellor's letter with a particular focus on the single coin metaphor. The blogger said, civility is not weighed equally with free speech. It is not a prerequisite of free speech. It's a value and idea to be tested in the marketplace with other values. Free speech is often uncivil. On another blog, a professor accused Dirks of misapprehensions about the nature of free speech and Berkeley's role in the movement. He said, in his efforts to set the limits of civility, the chancellor appears not to see the ways that he repeats the 1960s demonization of the movement, hardly praised in California in the early 1960s, as themselves barbarians at the gate of university discourse. The repetitive invocation of civility to set limits to acceptable speech reflects a broader and deeper challenge to intellectual freedom on campuses. These critics drew parallels to the decision by the University of Illinois to withdraw Salida's job offer. As one professor posted, instead of celebrating the 50th anniversary of the free speech movement with an endorsement of the right to speak one's mind, the chancellor has offered Berkeley a tepid, compromised vision of free speech that would in practice render it a hollow right. While the chancellor's message was framed as a request, some colleges have more formalized expectations of civility, the violation of which can lead to serious consequences. That was the case a couple of years ago for a professor who sued the University of South Dakota for violating his First Amendment rights by terminating his tenure-track faculty position after he called another professor, quote, a backstabbing sneak, close quote, in an email. The university said that he had violated its civility rules, but a federal district court in the ensuing litigation found the policy too vague and sided with the professor. Later, an appeals court overturned that ruling and sided with the university, saying that the professor reasonably should have recognized that his email ran afoul of the policy, that faculty discharge their duties constructively, treat each other with respect, and preserve and strengthen the willingness to cooperate. As we speak today, the colliding boundaries between civil discourse and free speech are looming throughout academic circles in this country, including right here in Eugene at the University of Oregon. And as you can see, courts are struggling, often inconsistently, with the limits to which uncivil speech can be regulated in a public setting. On the one hand, social and political processes, and indeed the search for truth, depend on free expression, including the expression of unpopular ideas. On the other hand, our social fabric depends on the ability to disagree without the kind of monopolistic dissent that literally would drown out debate itself. What the academic debate shows is that at its worst, Prescriptive civility is a way to avoid having difficult conversations at all. Today, the greatest structural driver in the civility war is the internet, where these two versions of the world collide. In that decentralized space, the common ground between us gets smaller, and it's become easier to fixate on incivility than to deal with whatever ideas rude language might describe. Interestingly, an overbearing prescriptive civility troubles people across the political spectrum. For those on the right, civility is political correctness by a different name, and those on the left tend to see it as a way of suppressing dissent. What unites these interpretations is a shared suspicion that the rules of civility exist to preserve the power of mistrusted hierarchies. These concerns remind us that people need to be able to raise tough questions when they feel that their vital interests are being threatened. A civil society can't avoid important issues simply because they're unpleasant. And this means that any reasonable definition of civil discourse has to recognize that the colliding interests that comprise our increasingly diverse society will produce an endless series of confrontations over difficult moral and distributional issues. Often these issues have an irreducible win-lose quality to them, and they won't be amenable to resolution by consensus. But while continuing confrontation is inevitable, the destructiveness that commonly accompanies it is not. To address this problem, conflict resolution specialists have been developing an approach they describe as constructive confrontation. This approach combines an understanding of conflict processes, dispute resolution, and advocacy strategies to help folks better advance their interests. In addition to explaining why the politeness embodied in civility is important, it identifies a number of practical strategies, most of them based on common sense, that everyone involved in disputes, including those caught in the middle, can use to improve the constructiveness of debate. There are several key components, and I'll just take a few minutes, if you don't mind, to summarize them briefly. Most of them are common sense, but they still need to be stated. First and foremost is a commitment to civility in the traditional and narrow sense of the word, and that is people need to recognize that other thoughtful and caring people can have different views on how best to address complex problems. Constructive debate has to focus on solutions that are most likely to be successful, not on personal attacks leveled against each other. The bestseller, Getting to Yes, says it well. You need to separate the people from the problem. When this isn't done, conflict tends to escalate so much that key decisions are made on the basis of personal animosities rather than the relative merits of competing ideas. Next, and frequently undervalued, at least in discussion, we need to marshal the facts. Many public policy disputes involve factual disagreements that are amenable to resolution through some type of fact-finding process. And the failure to discern available facts substantially increases the probability the situation may be so misunderstood that the solutions that end up getting adopted won't achieve the desired results. Got to work together to resolve factual disagreements. Clear the decks for a good decision. Now, of course, there are many cases, and particularly where we're dealing with the cutting edge of science, where there's a lot of uncertainty about what the facts really show or what inferences you can draw from them. Then we need to handle those disputes even more carefully and explain our rationales for the factual views that we adopt in a way that can encourage healthy debate. We need to limit interpersonal misunderstandings. Adversaries, as we all know, often proceed on the basis of inaccurate, sometimes unjustifiably evil images of the interests and actions of others. Civility requires contending parties to make an honest and continuing effort to understand the views and reasoning of their opponents, and the community needs to condemn the deliberate distortion of information and the presentation of unbalanced views as unacceptable. Just as important as deciding issues on the merits, we need to use fair processes, right? Due process in arriving at those decisions. Civility requires public issues be addressed by processes that are fair both in appearance and in fact. Public input has to be honestly solicited. Decisions need to be made on the merits of substantive arguments. Advocates of the status quo, for example, shouldn't be able to prevail simply by causing endless procedural delays that prevent alternative proposals from being acted on. And we need to limit escalation. The most destructive confrontation process, escalation, arises when perceived provocations produce a downward spiral of counter-provocations that transform a substantive debate into one where mutual contempt becomes the primary driver. And something else that gets overlooked sometimes, especially by mediators, is that we need to honor the legitimate use of legal and political power. Public policy disputes involve issues that people feel really strongly about, so they can be expected to use all lawful means in an attempt to prevail. This means that people are entitled to use the system to advance their interests if they do it properly. And we need to respect that right and not attempt to require them to renounce their redress options as a condition for discussion. We need to be pragmatic. Whenever possible, we need to frame the conflict in ways that transform up or down confrontations into win-win opportunities. And in cases where that can't happen, we need to recognize and accept the fact that legal and political institutions are going to have to make tough choices, and people need to live with them. We also need to limit backlash. While political and legal force may produce short-term victories, they always tend to generate a powerful backlash. People hate to be forced to do things against their will. Human nature being what it is, can be expected to launch a counterattack at the earliest opportunity. The best way to limit that is to take the approach that Lincoln tried to do and didn't have a chance to do because of his assassination, and that is returned kindness and fairness for the horrors of war. This emphasis on respecting fairness tends to produce more reasonable positions on both sides, and it makes it more difficult for contending parties to at least openly pursue selfish objectives. Not to put a fine point on it too much, we need to make ourselves more open to persuasion, don't we? One crucial element of civility is a recognition that it's possible we're wrong, and that the policies advocated by their opponents are actually better, or there's a middle ground that makes more sense than either position. This entails an obligation to seriously consider the persuasive value of other people's arguments, and to carefully then in return explain and try to justify your own. These practical and common sense ideas are underutilized in our current public discourse, but they're at the heart of what almost all successful enterprises do as naturally as breathing. Still, we would be foolish to think that they will work in every crisis. It's no accident that Washington and Lincoln, both fervent advocates for civil discourse, understood that it wouldn't always prevail in an environment where there was a true breakdown of agreement over core values. The founders were most concerned with what they called factions. They understood how factions could break down a social structure. One of the reasons they advocated for a federal system of government was to have a relatively stable union of different states. It was pragmatic. In that type of system, they felt that factions could be effectively balanced out against each other. It wasn't perfect, but it usually would be effective. That was their belief. And they understood that a common good usually could be worked out among citizens who disagree on this or that point of policy, because rarely is there just one way to accomplish something, whether it's worthy or unworthy. They understood that civic unity depends on an agreed vision of core values, and that when such an agreement is lacking, the resulting discord can produce civic disintegration. So with that risk in mind, I'd just like to read to you a brief statement by a religious leader, what he said about the perceived breakdown in consensus over core values in the United States. This is a quote. "When spelled out, what we have today in this country is an unbridgeable disagreement about what the family is. Misunderstand the family and all its complexities, what follows is that nothing else will go right. We have no common judgment about the meaning of our lives. One division maintains with no real proof that people have no given nature. Logically and politically, step-by-step consequences that are not accidental follow. We legalize contraception. Then when that doesn't work, abortion, euthanasia, fetal experimentation, homosexual marriages, and adoptions. We can even decide if we are male or female. A family is configured as we wish it to be. These practices have all become rights under positive law. They're systematically enforced. No criticism of them is allowed, no matter how scientifically or reasonably based it may be. The opposition to this development is not simply another opinion. It is a coherent articulation of what it is to be human. The killing of a human fetus as a right is not something that can be negotiated or compromised. It becomes either my way or your way. We cannot agree to live in peace with it as if it were a minor matter that had nothing to do with what the human state is. Close quote. Now, when you hear arguments expressed in that way, extremely articulate, it's readily apparent that resolving core differences about values is not nearly as simple as saying, can't we all just get along? When the disagreement goes to what are perceived as core societal values, the rules of engagement quickly shift. And there are communication codes that go along with that kind of shift. Sometimes, for example, talk of moral decline is connected with the ethos of the 1960s. For some folks, that era was less a decade than a collective memory of rebellious, long-haired rebels, authorities incapacitated by guilt and self-doubt, and an excess of tolerance that all combined to release a destructive surge of abortions, divorce, single parenthood, street crime, and other perceived signs of social decay. There's a refrain that some you hear on the radio today, that manners and values are dying in part as a consequence of a second American revolution that erupted in the 1960s. And it's true, of course, that some aspects of the ethos of the 60s were destructive, vicious, ignorant, and naive. But the decade also had other legacies, including the formal repudiation of white supremacy and the rise of equal rights under the rule of law as forces for good in American politics and culture. And the ethos of the 1960s also questioned such tenets of political culture as the belief that poverty is largely the fault of lazy, improvident, stupid, or otherwise undeserving people. These changes would not have been possible without some measure of social upheaval, including the kind of vehement political discourse that we describe as civil disobedience. Some people might dismiss this comparison on the ground that we simply don't face social upheaval and discord today with anything near the depth and ferocity as the conflict over civil rights in the Vietnam War. But this misperceives the intensity of feelings underlying the various battles that are being waged over the country's future. It underestimates the alienation felt by people on the right, like the theologian I just quoted, as well as outsiders on the left who insist that their worldviews deserve respect and not ridicule. It underestimates the sense of desperation felt by those who believe intensely that abortion is murder, that homosexuality is pathological, and that America is rightly viewed as a Christian nation. To the picketers, harassers, and bombers of abortion clinics, the conflict today is just as compelling as the conflict in the 60s, or even the conflict in values that ultimately led to the Civil War. And it's because these conflicts are so intense and seemingly intractable that we need more guidance about the role and limits of civil discourse than many folks think. Debating matters of public concern is essential in a free, self-governing society. We can see this logic in the First Amendment. The second half of it says that Congress can make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Those rights are often considered in isolation and as distinct guarantees, but they really build on each other and reinforce the fact that the people have the right by nature to control the government. If, for example, you disagree with a government policy and want the government to change it, you would first speak to others. To let as many people know as possible about your concerns, you would broadcast your position through the press and invite others to assemble to discuss the problem with you. And after deciding on a course of action, you would petition the government to address your concerns, just like the First Amendment says. But these rights also entail corresponding duties. Most importantly, civility towards those with whom you disagree, because after all, if you're not civil towards them, why should they be civil towards you? But the obligation is grounded in something deeper and more fundamental than just prudence or self-interest. Your rights to speak, broadcast, assemble, and petition require that you respect the right of others to do the same. This means that when we engage with other citizens, there's an obligation to do so with an appropriate level of civility. If we don't let others speak, then really we're attempting to impose our views on them. It becomes a kind of despotism where we seek to silence rather than engage. The Constitution forbids something that we call the heckler's veto, where angry people can shout down those with whom they disagree. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that speech can't be banned simply because it might offend a hostile mob. If a hostile mob could justify suppressing speech, then there would be no free speech. Whenever someone opposed the speech of another, they could simply threaten violence and have it suppressed. Although we have a duty to tolerate the speech of others, tolerance doesn't mean approval. Tolerance requires accepting the right of others to express their disapproval of your beliefs and actions. Yet, doing this runs against some of our most basic inclinations, I hate to say. Alexis de Tocqueville, back in the early 1800s, identified what he thought of as a powerful desire for uniformity in democracies that extends even to what we think. In America, he said, the majority draws a formidable circle around thought. Because of this tendency to preserve freedom of thought and discussion, we need to inculcate the sort of self-interested tolerance in our public discourse that's a necessary predicate for healthy intellectual disagreement. That understanding includes tolerance of the right to petition and challenge government action through civil disobedience. The civil rights movement showed that self-government embodied by the right to speak, broadcast, assemble, and petition also requires that citizens possess the virtue of courage. Speaking out against an unjust but popular law exposes people to ridicule, contempt, and even danger. But a free society needs citizens, when things get serious, who will expose themselves to those risks, and doing that requires courage. The leaders of the civil rights movement risked their freedom and their lives, many of them from Oregon, including one of my former law partners, to protest the injustices of Jim Crow laws and segregation. Without their courage and the civic tolerance of other well-intentioned people, those injustices would never have received the attention required to compel national action. Civil disobedience is an often misunderstood component of civil discourse. People like Martin Luther King Jr. violated what they saw as unjust laws, but they also willingly accepted the punishment that came with violating the law. That's true civil disobedience. Unfortunately, it's often confused with simply violating laws you don't like. Not so. It demands accepting the punishment. Otherwise, there would be no principled distinction between civil disobedience and lawlessness. Someone, for instance, I could claim that I oppose excessively high prices for Coca-Cola and steal a 2-liter bottle as a sign of my displeasure. But if I don't accept the punishment for stealing, you'd have no way of knowing if I really believed that prices were unfairly high or if I just wanted the free Coke. Too often, we think that there should be no conflict between our preferences and our principles. We insist that nobody who makes sandwiches we like should have opinions with which we disagree. But if we really believe in the principles of freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition, and the logic of self-government that follows from them, then we have to accept the right of those with whom we disagree to express their disagreement. It's challenging to live in an environment that makes people believe in the power of incivility. As I noted at the outset, there's a view among too many Americans that vulgarity and rudeness are normal and acceptable. They see it in action, in reality TV, hear it on the radio, on the internet, and readily accept and sometimes relish it on social media. Even more troubling is that modern-day culture, driven in part by media portrayals and focus, can lead people to assume that civility isn't happening in America, that noise, confrontation, in-your-face behavior will have to guide our interpersonal relationships from now on. And disbelief in the effectiveness of civility even prompts inaction by well-meaning people. I was talking to a friend recently who was lamenting the loss of shared values in our country, and I told him that I believe we need to dig deeper for shared values as a guide for civil dialogue and as a way of finding good solutions. It'll never happen, he said. You're an idealist. We're too far gone. I disagreed, and I told him so. I believe that most people want civil discourse, but they don't always see it modeled effectively. So it's easy to assume in an era of widespread trash talk that civility doesn't work. But it isn't dead. It's just underappreciated. We need to remember that in the America that actually works, civility is used every day. Virtually every major community has a United Way, a League of Women Voters branch, and many other public service organizations. This creates settings where diverse people come together, support important educational, health-related, and human service causes. Imagine this effort occurring without people being civil and collaborative. In communities that function well, kindness, care, respect, and collaboration take place every day, whether it's practiced by volunteers delivering meals on wheels, leaders working on pressing community issues, teachers working with students, Rotarians picking up litter on roadsides, and people worshiping in churches. Civility quietly and effectively maintains the pulse of community well-being. Each of these efforts involves coordinated collective action among people who frequently have major differences of opinion. I'm sure that exists right here in this room. But despite those differences, a common enterprise can permit all participants to have a shared vision for change, one that includes an agreed understanding of the problems they face and a joint approach to solving them. Collective impact requires that differences be discussed and resolved. You don't have to agree with everyone else about the issues, but you must understand that there will always be divisions. But you must, again, agree on the primary goals for your effort. And you have to develop trust in each other in order to make it work. Stakeholders have to have regular communication and mutual engagement to build up enough experience to recognize and appreciate the common motivation behind their individual efforts. And they need time to see that their own interests will be treated fairly, that decisions will be made on the basis of objective evidence and the best possible solution to the problem, not to favor the priorities of one faction over another. I've seen this formula for bringing diverse interests together work well in Oregon state government, so I'd like to close with a personal story that's meaningful to me and my colleagues in public service. In 2005, I first met a man named Wayne Krieger. He was a retired state police officer and a staunch Republican legislator from the South Coast area. He was deeply skeptical, and publicly so, of the judicial system and his perception of its handling of both substantive and administrative issues. He was also a committed foster parent, and he was anxious to improve the juvenile dependency system in Oregon, as was I, and so were a number of other Oregon judges. So we sat down for lunch at the Court of Appeals one day in 2005, an equal number of legislators and judges, and we got acquainted as people and public servants. We talked about common concerns, and from that start, we began a decade-long partnership to improve law and procedure with respect to the well-being of children and families and our child welfare system, and to advance an agenda of increased accountability in all three branches of government. As a result of these efforts, in 2007, the so-called Gang of Four legislators produced a series of measures to address issues related to children in foster care. That core group was comprised of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, then Senator, now Governor Kate Brown, Senator Jeff Cruz from Roseburg, Representative Krieger, and the other Democrat was Representative Mike Schaffler from suburban Portland. Along with representatives of the executive and judicial branches, they convened a work group that met more than 20 times over the course of 14 months. The product was 6 major substantive bills that passed with virtually no opposition to help improve and reform our dependency system and that modernize the processes and procedures that courts use in these sensitive cases involving our most vulnerable children. Regarding this bipartisan effort, Representative Krieger said at the end of it, "This is the greatest cooperation I've seen among the judicial, legislative, and executive branches. These bills help protect children and parents, improve the court process, and help the Department of Human Services better provide the services that are so critical." To this day, Wayne Krieger and I have real differences of opinion on a lot of issues. But I agree wholeheartedly with him that open communication and effective and appropriate collaborative efforts among the 3 branches of government are critical to improve the lives of people in our state and strengthen our system of government. This same collaborative spirit has spurred a number of additional efforts to improve interbranch understanding of common problems in Oregon. In 2009, our Chief Justice established a judicial ride-along program in which individual legislators spent a full day in their local courts watching crucial parts of interactions in the criminal justice system. We saw the same spirit in 2011 when the Oregon House was evenly split 30-30 between Democrat and Republican members. I never saw a better model of cooperation in Oregon government than that year, when leaders of both parties, including the members of the Gang of Four, repeatedly showed that principled compromise fostered by civil discourse was the only way forward. They looked for ways to collaborate for two reasons: because they couldn't get anything done otherwise, and they saw the value of principled compromise. And in the short legislative session in 2012, a byproduct of this collaboration, which included the adoption of data-driven performance metrics by the Court of Appeals, resulted in the addition of a new panel of 3 judges to that court, the most overworked appellate court in the United States. Today, despite deepening political divisions in so many areas, the commitment to collaborate in addressing systemic child welfare issues, in addressing difficult issues at the intersection between mental health and criminal justice, and to improve government accountability persists among many key leaders in Oregon's 3 branches. The formula is straightforward: an equal mix of honest engagement, accountability, diligence, and respect for the golden rule. And as an overarching approach, a commitment to civil discourse about tough issues, with an understanding that although civility, rightly understood, can't be imposed, it must be embraced if we're going to get the people's work done. There are no shortcuts. I know that you believe in the same approach to civic problem solving, and I really want to thank the League for everything you do year in and year out to promote the values of constructive civic engagement. Your example reminds us all of the right way to advance the public interest in good government. I want to thank you for including me and other public officials, past and present, in this important discussion of values, and I hope that we can keep moving forward together. Thank you for your time.
So thank you, Dave, and I think you've addressed so many facets of the topic. I wanted to ask about the economic part of it, whether or not you thought it was incivil or uncivil to not shop, for example, at the place that I disagreed with because they took a public position. But that's one question, so I got to ask one out first. Darla has the microphone, and if you just raise your hand, she'll run to you and bring it to you.
Well, let me just respond to that question, Linda, with the answer that it depends. I think when the differences are the kinds of what I would call the grist of day-to-day issues, to me, it seems a little extreme. I'm not sure I'd describe it as incivil, but maybe improvident, to be that thin-skinned about people's disagreement. I do think, though, there are times, and this gets back to a little bit to the discussion about civil disobedience, where people feel that there's a huge moral dilemma and they just don't want to support a cause or an enterprise that's spending money to do something that they think is so wrong that it threatens the societal well-being. It's a line-drawing process, like so many things are, right? But I think for the most part, when it comes to just ordinary political disagreements, to me, that can be an overreaction.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you have published a book or written it. Why not?
Well, actually, yeah, this has just gotten me thinking more about it. Being invited to do this has just summed up a lot of feelings and thoughts I've had about this over the years, but I haven't written anything other than this speech.
But also, the power of money has changed. And from the 60s and 70s to get legislation passed, it's made a huge difference in our legislative process.
Yeah.
And it sickens me.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how we can deal with this with discourse.
Well, I think, first of all, the courts, everybody hear the question? Can everybody hear the question? It was how do you deal with the effect of money
in public discourse, and it is a huge problem. And one of the things that I think my branch of government has to do is constantly fight for equal access to justice. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege of talking to lawyers and community members at the Campaign for Equal Justice, which is the legal aid lunch here in Eugene, talking about the critical importance of making sure that people who can't afford to hire a lawyer still get to have their civil grievances heard in court, and how the courts can create processes that level the playing field of access, not skew the results, because even rich people can be right, and when they're right, they should win. You know, that's not much of an epiphany, right? But what we're talking about is equal access to justice and the right to have your grievances heard. We can't hold together unless we do it. So the courts are on that, I think, full time. I'm also involved with something called the State Justice Institute, which is it's the only federal body that actually provides any financial support to the state courts. It still exists, even this year. But what we do is we're a grant providing agency that encourages courts to streamline their administrative processes to make it easier to get from point A to point B in the litigation process. This is a very comprehensive effort that must be undertaken. There is no quick fix. There are still great inequalities in the system. Relatively speaking, I think there is better access to justice today, particularly in Oregon, because of a commitment of corporations and large law firms, frankly, to support this, because they see it as smart. It's good PR. Many of them are actually supporting the equal justice movement, which is alive and well in Oregon. Millions of dollars are raised by lawyers every year to support legal aid for people that can't afford it. There's still a tremendous shortage, but each branch of government, each part of the community needs to be thinking of ways to level the playing field so that it's truly more fair. I can speak to what our side is doing, and I think that needs to be done constantly in the legislature, in terms of access to legislators, in terms of government ethics. We have a Standards and Practices Commission that absolutely needs to be adequately funded as a watchdog and pursue any of these backdoor deals that involve improper influence. And so that exists at the legislative and executive levels.
Thank you, first of all. And secondly, this is what we needed to hear, but I'd also like to be somehow access to what you said so that I can read it again. And I'd like every high school to have this as a part of their curriculum. And I don't know if it's possible that we can talk you out of what you said in print, but it would make a difference. We could make a difference. We could share it.
Well, it never occurred to me that anybody would want to read it, but I'm glad to share it.
I would.
So I'll get it to Linda.
would.
I'll get it to Linda. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. I really like hearing about that line drawing, because it seems like over time those lines get changed and morphed, and really you can think of things around pornography, for example, sexual harassment. Can you speak to the current legal structure around hate speech? Because it seems like that's an issue that's really kind of blurring the lines today.
Yeah. Well, as you may well know, there are a lot of folks in Europe who were just literally, sort of like de Tocqueville was 200 years ago, blown away by the way Americans can talk to each other and about each other. The libel laws are much stronger in Europe, right? If you say something that approaches hate speech, that can be a crime. You can go to jail for that. A lot of Americans bridle at that, and the biggest problem, of course, is dealing with rallies like KKK rallies and Nazi rallies, and where in the past, even the ACLU has supported marches by those organizations, and I think it's particularly significant. It's sort of a bellwether for me to see the ACLU seriously considering revising its position about that. To me, that's a seismic shift, potentially. because it reflects a sense that maybe that line has been drawn so far on one side that it's promoted violence and discord that could permanently damage our society. The thing we have to remember, though, regardless of our politics, that the rules have to apply equally to everyone, whether on the left or the right, in order to work. And so I think that's going to be the next part of the debate, is actually the folks who are really, really upset with the Klan and with hate speech and the kinds of things that we all find so disgusting out there today with these shock jocks, that it could apply to them. You hold a mirror up to yourself. And I think this reflects in some ways the debate in universities right now over academic freedom, because hate is an equal opportunity liability. And self-righteousness, which is something that I think is an important impediment to civility. It's pretend civility. But self-righteousness is a huge enemy for all of us, human nature being what it is. Just because we think we have the moral edge doesn't mean the discussion's over. When I was reading that article by that conservative Catholic theologian, what an incredible writer that man is, and what an ability to articulate his ideas. And those are, the way the law is today for him and for so many other people, it's fighting time. It really is. We have to find good, constructive ways to downplay that tension and to de-escalate it. That's why I was talking about some of those ideas on constructive disagreement, which, again, they can sound naive, but they're the tools we have to work with. They're the tools that have worked best in the past. And we can't give up, even though we know some of our greatest leaders in history, people like Lincoln and Washington, sometimes it didn't work for them. But why do we revere them, Lincoln, today? It's because he never quit, and he put his life on the line for those things. Yeah. Well, you've been very kind. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.